This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. For this episode, we're speaking to journalist James Montague, and he's going to be speaking to us about the way in which football ultras have quite significantly influenced various different violent uprisings and revolutions across the world. In some cases, these ultras ended up even being soldiers, militants in ongoing wars. Very interesting topic. If you like what we're doing, please do consider supporting us on our Patreon. That's patreon.com/popularfront. So firstly, congratulations on the book. From what I've read, it's really fucking interesting, man. I really like it. But what we're going to be talking about today is basically how football hooligans aided the fight in Ukraine against the Russian-backed separatists. I don't even know really where to start with this. So maybe just kind of explain to us, how did you get involved in this? You know, talking to the football hooligan firms that ended up actually being, you know, soldiers and militants.
Well, I mean, years ago I started writing about football, but and none of it was actually about football. I think I was desired to, you know, be a foreign correspondent in some way, but I was a bit of a failed foreign correspondent. So I kept on finding these kind of football stories that really reflected a lot of really political subjects, and especially in the Middle East. And a lot of them ended up being about conflicts and war. And obviously, you don't find organised football leagues in war zones, right? In conflict zones. It's one of the first things that goes out the window. But you know, you started to notice these stories. Like, I mean, I was in Zambia one time, and I did a story about the Libyan national football team trying to qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations, and they're in the middle of the civil war. Gaddafi had been toppled, but he hadn't yet been caught. And Gaddafi's sons were like massive fans of the national football team and tried to kind of use it to keep kind of Gaddafi in power and try to, you know, this patriotism, this rally around the flag effect. And so, you know, a lot of the players are actually fighting on the front lines for the rebels. And I found that this story, there's one of the players there was, he was fighting in Misrata, and his, you know, CO said, listen, you need to get Libya to the Africa Cup of Nations. You could do more good for Libya playing there than you would be, you know, maybe taking a sniper's bullet here. And they sent him back to Zambia to play this game against Zambia, and they managed to qualify. It was a huge national moment as well. And a few days later, they found, I mean, obviously, you know, everyone knows what happened to Gaddafi a few days later. But those are the kind of stories that I was really interested in. And one of the things that I've always come across is just organisation of football fans. Because if you ask most people in the UK or anywhere really around the world, ask about football fans, they think they're stupid or violent or racist. And that's kind of the first three words that usually come out of anybody's mouths. But what I discovered was that really they're organised, extraordinarily political, extremist in a way. You don't really find centrist ultras in many places. You find them far left, far right. And so I decided to write this book, 1312 Among the Ultras, because I wanted to tell the story of a particular form of organisation of football fans, which is the ultras movement, which kind of emerges out of Italy in the late 1960s. Extremely hierarchical. People live it almost like a gang, like they live it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in this organisational structure, which is extraordinarily hierarchical, very patriarchal, very male, not a lot of women involved, certainly not back in the day. And it usually involves these climactic displays of flares, messaging. So you'd have whatever political issue was of that week would be written on the choreography and shown. And obviously this is before social media, so a lot of times it wouldn't be recorded. It would just be whatever was the issue that week that they wanted to, whether that was ticket prices or racism or whatever issue that was there. And so this kind of subculture ends up spreading all around the world. And so you end up kind of a mixture of ultras and like the Barras Bravas in South America, a bit of hooliganism from England and from Scotland. And it becomes a dominant youth culture, like one of the biggest youth cultures in the world, like millions of people around the world, extremely anti-police, hence why I called it 1312, which is, you'll literally see that number code on every single football stadium around the world. Like I saw it in Casablanca, Bosnia, You see it in Moscow, you see it in Berlin, you see it in... actually, I don't think I saw one in Riyadh, but you'll see it pretty much everywhere. And... there's hatred of the police, hatred of authority, a need and a want to be kind of, no face, no name is one of the big phrases that you see in ultra culture. That you are outside of social control, you're outside of government control and police control, and you want kind of anonymity to be in a subculture to do what you want. And a lot of the times that could be, fighting opponents, although there's not that much violence in the scene anymore. But on the side of that, there's also there's a kind of another scene, that kind of a subculture within a subculture called like arranged fighting, where you have these firms that fight each other in these extraordinarily well-organized, ultra-violent battles all across Europe. It can be 5 versus 5, 10 versus 10, 100 versus 100. The Eastern Europeans, particularly like Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Scandinavians are very good at it as well. And again, they're completely secret. And they have to arrange it. It's called a collar footballer in Ukraine and in Russia as well.
This is what we would have considered like hooliganism back in the day, right, in the UK.
Yeah, but back in the day in the UK, it was very much urban warfare between two groups of pissed up lads, and that was it. This is completely different. This is there are rules involved, right? You've got to come up with the same numbers. You're not allowed weapons. There's certain honour,
right,
in the type of fights that you have, right? And if the other side doesn't turn up, then that is you couldn't dishonour their group more. You should basically dissolve your group if you don't turn up. And so, and these guys, it was about bravery and fueled by alcohol in England. But when we saw, I don't know if you remember back in 2016 when the European Championships was in France, England were playing Russia. And this was a really important moment because England has an extremely well-regarded reputation because of the casual movement in the 80s and a lot of films like Green Street Hooligans, which a lot of even when I went to Indonesia, a lot of ultras there, they see it almost as a documentary. Like this is how you
deeply appalling film as well.
It is, but I think I'll make a grandiose claim that says that apart from Harry Potter, I can't think of a British film in the 21st century that has had such a big influence on youth culture around the world. Is literally like, you will not believe how, like, I remember meeting a group called La Familia in Jerusalem, and they're the kind of ultras of Beitar Jerusalem, ultra nationalists, racist, I would say, on the fascist scale. Literally never had a Palestinian or an Arab play for them, riot anytime a Palestinian or Arab will get on this, even rumoured to sign for the team. So a really kind of hardcore bunch. Don't like foreigners, obviously don't like journalists as well. Journalists are seen as the same as the police or the government. Like, we're just lackeys for them, basically, like painting the ultras in a bad way. And, as soon as they found out that I was from England and I was a West Ham fan, they didn't speak any English apart from I'm West Ham till I die in a Mockney accent, And I thought, that's what amazing... But what a powerful thing that film has been, which most people would ridicule, in England, but actually, has meant a lot to a lot of people. And so that's kind of how most people view kind of hooligan groups, this kind of very English style. But in 2016, when Russia played England, this was the new world, the collar footballer against, this old beer-bellied, skinhead, 40s and 50-year-old English guys. They were up against guys that were ripped, that were trained in martial arts.
Fully henched off. Like, the footage is mental.
Yeah, I mean, henched up. And all of these guys are from the collar footballer scene, right? Where you are learning several martial arts. You are training. A lot of them don't drink, which is mad. I've got a Polish family. And so, like, to not drink is a if you meet a Polish guy who doesn't drink, it's quite a big thing. So, and they're not drinking. A lot of them take steroids and whatever, but they are weapons, and you saw the way and there was one poor guy who was put in a hospital in a coma and he never really recovered. I think he was attacked with a hammer, but this was the moment where, like, that type of English hooliganism forever was banished, and that this is the new order, the new way. And I thought this is such a kind of like, and you also have left-wing ultras, by the way, in Germany, like St. Pauli, have their own fighting firms as well in Hamburg. So,
I've been there. They're a great bunch.
Yeah, they're a great bunch, and so you've got this incredible, varied, kind subculture, but because they hate journalists and authors and people sniffing around and telling their, grassing on them in a way, I guess that's how they see it. It's almost impossible to write the story of who they are, where they came from, how this really important culture existed, or how it kind of like came to life. And so I decided to write 1312 to do that. And I felt I was long enough in my career that I could, I wasn't considered like other journalists, because I never really write about football. I go there and I never had any money when I started out, so I was always standing behind the goals in the cheapest seats where the ultras, or standing where the ultras always stood, and that's how I always understood football. When I went to West Ham, I stood in the North Bank, and so I was not quite considered one of them, but I was considered like, okay, you can come in and
he's all right, sort of thing.
He's all right, as long as you have the right person, because it's all about finding the right person, because it's a culture that also kind of like shuns social media. Like nothing's got to be put on, nothing can be put online. Everything's done on Telegram. It's face-to-face contact. So if somebody vouches for you, then all the doors can be open. But if somebody says, no, this guy's a prick, there's just everything shut. And not only that, but because there's a network of friendships and alliances that stretch all across Europe, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of scenario. So if you upset one person or one group, like doors will shut all across Europe to know that this bell end is coming. Don't let him in. But I felt that, I got to that point where I could just about tell those stories and get access to people by, not being a bell end, I suppose is one way of saying it. But like, I wanted to, why have you done it? Tell me the story about how you got into this and what the attraction is to it. Because I was attracted to the same things. And I think they picked up on that. And one of the chapters was about Ukraine, because what was clear is that when you've got an organized subculture, youth subculture, right? And within the right circumstances, whether that is a political uprising, a revolution, or political upheaval in that country, that this is an important constituency of, like, you suddenly have thousands of organised, henched young men who know how to fight the police, who know how, because they do it week in, week out, they know how to fight each other, they know how to deal with tear gas, they know police tactics. Whereas in a lot of civil uprisings, if you've got activists on the front line, they haven't got a clue about how to do any of this. And
what you just kind of explained with the large-scale connections across borders, not going on social media, keeping it all hush-hush, even with the street violence, they know how to deal with that. A lot of it's street politics as well. Like, to be honest, it's the perfect foundation for a militant group. You know what I mean?
It's absolutely, and I mean, we'll talk about this a bit later, but a lot of politicians, especially in Eastern Europe, have worked that out as well and have used these groups in many respects as kind of street vigilantes to help further their own political careers. So this is certainly the case in Poland, certainly the case in Hungary, definitely in Serbia, where I was living up until quite recently. So, yeah, it's, the first place I saw this really take action, and it was over a number of years, was in Egypt. And in Egypt, I saw how a group of guys, one of Amadou Fahmy was started a group of ultras for Al Ahly back in 2007. And I interviewed him for a story I did for The Guardian. But we always stayed in touch. And over the years, this group became literally 20,000 people strong. And they were fighting the police every week during the worst of the Mubarak years. So when the Tahrir Square revolution came, Amadou and his guys and all the other ultra groups that then copied them were all in Tahrir Square, and these are the guys who were fighting the police. And they became known afterwards when the revolution happened. They were known as kind of saviors of the revolution, and they became kind of heroes until there was an incident called the Port Said massacre, where 72 of them were killed, murdered essentially by rival ultras after a game in Port Said, but with the collusion of the state as a kind of, this was a warning and also kind of a punishment for beating the police. And it was the beginning of the end, really, of the revolution. And all these guys were ended up being, essentially outlawed. And Amadou, he was one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. It turned out his father was one of the most kind of connected people in Egypt, but he was bringing rich and poor, because class cleavage is one of the main issues in Egypt. He was bringing rich and poor fans together, Christian, and I mean, there were even some Brotherhood guys there, and men and women as well. There were some women, and he brought them all together. And it turns out that his dad was like the general secretary of the Confederation of African Football all this time. We had to keep that on the down low, and I had to keep his identity secret. And eventually what happens when he's out, when this is all outlawed, he then becomes the general secretary when his dad retires of African football, goes into African football to try and destroy all the corruption that he sees and takes an ultra mentality into it. And within a year, he's basically kicked out the job, but he leaks a load of these documents that prove what's been going on. And the president of CAF ends up getting banned from football for 8 years. Unfortunately, he died of cancer last year. It was really tragic. Like he just got married and he's had a 3-month-old daughter. But, you see what people say about ultras and about football fans, and you see someone like Amine Fahmy and you think, this is, in the right circumstances, this is like you said, like the platform almost for a militant group, but also can affect positive change, sometimes negative change. But it's an actor in conflict, and it can't be ignored. And Turkey's another one where you had the Gezi Park protests. The ultras again came together. I mean, it's there's a story behind that as well. But the one that is the most relevance really to direct conflict is Ukraine, because ultra groups and fighting firms from the main clubs end up playing this massive role in Maidan. They end up becoming kind of allies almost with liberal activists, protectors of the liberal activists. And then even the most kind of ardent lefty activist would say this in Ukraine. And then they end up becoming part of this fighting battalion, Azov, which ends up playing a key role on the front line in eastern Ukraine.
Well, yeah, let's kind of go back to the Maidan. I remember, I know exactly what you're talking about as well. There's particularly right sector at the time, and there's a bit of confusion. Some people say they're called that because they're right wing. Now, they definitely are right wing, but they weren't called that. They were called right sector because they were on the right sector of the Maidan, protecting, the people that were not as adept at street fighting. But a lot of them came out of football hooligan or football ultra firms as well. Same as Azov. Maybe you can tell us about some of these ultra groups that eventually gave birth to, Azov militants.
I'll tell this story through the guy I told the story through, who I found it was a very fascinating individual called Sergei Filimonov, and he was essentially the leader of one of the big crews from Dynamo Kiev. And now Dynamo Kiev, the ultra group, very, very right wing, a lot of racism involved there as well. And you see, he had a group called the Radici, right, the relatives. And this was, you had the ultras group, and then you had these little break-off fighting firms who would go off and do these collar footballer matchups with other Ukrainian teams and with other fighting crews in Poland and when I went to one of these arranged fights. They are brutal, absolutely brutal. In fact, the other side didn't turn up, so it turned out to be a riot in the end in this kind of suburb of Stockholm. And I ended up, this is how far in I'd got at that point, that we'd met. It was supposed to be an 80 versus 80 fight on a disused railway track, and the other side didn't turn up. And we ended up, this guy said, "Oh yeah, come with me." And I thought, "Oh yeah, well, let's see what happens." The other side, this is all organised fighting, right? It's going to be fine. But, they're not hurting anybody else except for each other. And then, they turn up in Solna, which is like a district outside Stockholm, and start going to the pubs where they think these guys are drinking, and just they end up smashing everything up, beating people. I'm running along, and eventually the police start chasing us. And it's like, at that point, I'm like, well, what can I do? I can't put my hand up. I haven't got a release cord that says, I'm a journalist, I can leave now. I'm in. If I get caught, I get arrested. So I end up running with them. And we managed to escape. There's a helicopter in the sky. There's like police vans everywhere, tear gas getting fired. And I managed to escape, and it was pretty hairy stuff. But it was seeing the violence up close. It's not, it's not frontline violence. It's not people getting shot in the head, but it's still pretty brutal kind of situation. And when you see that, these guys were saying, the Ukrainians, they're the number one in the world, pretty much at this type of fighting. And Sergei Filimonov was the kind of the leader of this. And when I was speaking to him about like 2013, that there's a although they're obviously on the right, a lot of them are fascists, neo-Nazis. That there was a common enemy in Viktor Yanukovych. And there was a common enemy in Russian interference in the country. So, especially when it came to the Dynamo Kiev ultras and firms, and especially like Lviv, there's a kind of an alliance between the clubs. Like I think it was Dnipro, Dynamo Kiev and Lviv and some of the other clubs around there that were very much kind of pro-Ukrainian nationalists, and then much more pro-Russian nationalists from Shakhtar Donetsk, because obviously that's in the east, in the Donbass, Odessa, and I think in Kharkiv as well. But what was interesting is that when the kind of Maidan started, that all of those groups, even though some of them were quite pro-Russian, they ended up joining together to try to get rid of, to help within the Maidans in their own separate squares in their own cities to overthrow Yanukovych as well. And so they would turn up to these marches, and again, they were the people who knew how to deal with tear gas. They knew how to deal with the street thugs who were kind of hired by the government. They knew exactly what the police were doing, whereas a lot of the activists didn't really know what they were doing, and they needed that kind of protection. And so you mentioned right sector. I mean, one of the key figures here is Andrei Beletsky, who was the commander of Azov. Again, I don't think we're saying anything too legal here, saying that he was a neo-Nazi.
Oh yeah, he ran Patriot of Ukraine, was openly far right. Yeah.
Open far right, and then the Social Nationalist Assembly, and then that kind of evolves into right sector, and then he becomes the commander of the Azov battalion. And what happens is that Maidan happens, and all these groups, Ukrainian ultras from all across the country, they descend on Maidan, and they play this really important role. They play a role that I'd seen in other revolutions and other civil conflicts, which was knowing how to fight and teaching other people how to fight. And that's certainly Sergei Filimanov's experience of fighting on the front lines. But when Yanukovych eventually leaves, then it's like, what next? What do we do? Where do we go? And it's Beletsky who starts this, or who becomes the commander of Azov, who starts recruiting guys from the Akola footballer scene. And what was interesting, there's a brilliant Dima. I think you put me in touch with Dima originally. He made a film for Ukrainian television about the ultras, and there's an interview with Beletsky in it. And he says, I had to bring together this because going back a little bit, the Ukrainian army was a shambles. It'd been massively underfunded for years. I mean, on purposely massively underfunded, and filleted by corruption. Corruption is the number one issue in Ukrainian society, other than the war that's going on at the moment, and it's still going on in the east. And he said, essentially a law was changed by Arsen Avakov, who's this kind of almost like a far right Svengali. He's the Ministry of the Interior, but he began this process of having these militias begun to be formed, and Azov was perhaps the best known, and Beletsky started recruiting from the Akola footballer scene people like Sergei Filimanov and many others. And in this interview he says there's about 65% of Azov came from Akola footballer, came from the ultras and firms, and the reason they were ready straight away to be organised, to be trained and to be fought was because they'd already been doing that off their own back to fight each other over the past 4 or 5 years. And so, and it was interesting that he said that the biggest issue that he had within Azov in the beginning, whilst he was training everybody, was having to overcome this divide between, like this, on the one hand, there was the allies of Lviv, Dnipro and Dynamo Kiev, and on the other side, Odessa, Kharkiv and Shakhtar Donetsk. So he had to kind of overcome that. So these
football rivalries,
these are guys that would, they would, fight each other, bloody deaths. I mean, this is a hatred. And so overcoming that barrier was almost bigger than overcoming like the fact that nobody had any shoes or guns or bullets or anything. The first thing you needed to get is unity. And so they kind of came together, and you can see the success of it really, because whilst the Ukraine, you saw it firsthand, the Ukrainian army was, routed almost everywhere. But at Mariupol, there was a successful defense of the city, which was absolutely vital for Ukraine to keep any kind of foothold in the Donbass. I mean, if they'd lost Mariupol, because it's a massive steelworks, it's a port, it's the access really to the Sea of Azov, and so they proved themselves there to be a successful fighting force. And it wasn't just the fighting either. It was supply lines. Because they were so badly prepared, the ultras that didn't go, or guys who were in ultra groups and not in fighting firms, because there's a network of communication and allies. They started. There's an organisation called Narodny Tyl, which was like kind of the National Home Front that was gathering supplies, and these ultras and a lot of them were capos from the ultra groups were, if they weren't fighting, they were procuring vehicles from Europe. Like they told me, this one guy was telling me that I interviewed, he'd managed to get a load
procuring.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure anyone was stealing them on spec, but he certainly was getting pretty. I mean, also a lot of them were pretty old, shitty, like Land Rovers, for instance, and then using what they could to then reinforce them, to put some armor on it, and then sending them down to the front line, getting guns, saying that they were for hunting, sending those down to the front line, getting shoes. The biggest thing that they were doing was getting Chinese-made, really cheap Chinese-made drones and getting them down to the front line as well, so that they at least could see artillery positions and what was going on there. So
all this was done through the networks already created by the football ultra scene, basically.
Exactly, and
fascinating.
And because it's so organised, and it's ultra groups, certainly not in this part of the world. I mean, generally, especially in Italy as well, these aren't democracies. There is a capo, there's a guy at the top, and he has his lieutenants underneath, and it's a very strict hierarchy. So things get done, very quickly, and so the football scene there plays its role in this battle, and obviously building the myth of the ultras. I mean, if you go and speak to any activist there, they'll say, yeah, do you know what, these guys, they did play their role in Maidan, and they did go and fight and volunteer and risk their lives, and many of them did die. But that myth obviously then becomes something that has been used, especially by what Azov then becomes next, as a kind of a myth that's been built around this group of people.
Yeah, there is this. There's also like some misconceptions around Azov, which Azov will say, without us, the war would have, everybody would have died. We would have lost Ukraine. They've actually not been in anywhere near as many battles as they make out, but they certainly were effective in the ones that they were in. But yeah, unfortunately now, like, you can't ignore the kind of far right element to it. It has become its own beast.
It has, and that's definitely true. I mean, even Filomonov himself proves himself to be a great fighter, but I can't remember, is it Ilivosk, which is the meat grinder? The meat grinder. Where, I mean, no one really knows, but could be anything up to 1,000 Ukrainian troops were perhaps massacred, having basically, surrendered and retreated. And he was part of that. He retreated, he was injured in it, and that's why he was then, sent back and started life, civvy life after that. So there were lots of defeats, but I think you can say, and you can see it when you go to Mariupol today. I mean, this was 2 years ago when I went, but there is still an appreciation for Azov there, and I think they probably did have an effect in that one single battle. But the myth of it has certainly been built up, and what's most interesting actually is kind of what happens next, because the story of what happens to Filomonov is very fascinating, because he's quite you can find him on Instagram, right? He's a really handsome guy. He's got loads of tats over him. Some of them extremely dubious in terms of whether they're far right or not. I mean, he's not quite as, like, his right hand man had literally 2 swastikas tattooed behind his ear. So I mean, there's no getting around that. I mean, you can't misinterpret that. He's very intelligent. He's a good organizer and he's a good orator. And so the next step after a lot of these fighters then and ultras get back is they don't really, I mean, they do go back a little bit into the ultra scene, but they've obviously seen bigger battles, and there's now been this truce behind the groups that were formerly fighting. And so he becomes kind of the lead organizer for the National Corps, which becomes the political party that emerges out of Azov, with Bieletsky becomes the head. I mean, he'd already been in Parliament by then for a few years. I think he was there as the right sector MP, but then he becomes head of the National Corps. And it was clear to me when I met him that he was being groomed for political power because he was, he's a smart guy. But what was interesting is that when I met him, the way he wasn't, fighting anymore on the front lines, but he was involved in some pretty direct activism. So one of the things that I followed him around for a few weeks was obviously corruption is one of the biggest issues. So they would turn up at the building sites of oligarchs who they said would have stolen that land to build something, whatever, and they'll just swarm it and beat up all the the security that had been hired there by other oligarchs. They would campaign on behalf of. There was a Katerina Handzuk, who was a activist from the city of Curzon, she was an anti-corruption activist, liberal anti-corruption activist, and she was murdered, essentially assassinated.
Through acid.
Somebody poured acid. And it took her months and months to die. It's the most horrible way. I mean, she posted a picture on social media. It was shortly before she died, and it was horrific. But they were campaigning. So when I met him the first time, he was outside, and you could tell when they turn up at protests because they'd bring flares. Right? Who brings flares out apart from ultras and football fans? Like maybe sailors, but they definitely weren't sailors. So they turn up with these. And with big barriers saying we're not going to stop until we get justice for Handzuk, right? Because they saw. I mean, a cynic would say that they were using issues like wedge issues that they knew that, or not wedge issues, but the exact opposite, unifying issues that would get people on board and to soften their image. But when I talked to him, I think he believed it. This is a disgrace that this happened to her, and we might not be political, on the same side, but this is, we are against corruption, and so we're on the same side in that respect. So he was definitely, he was campaigning there. Lots of other kind of far righty type, like not far righty, but kind of very nationalist concerns like Ukrainian language, and there's a lot of like going out and capturing and doing citizens arrests on people who they thought had volunteered for militias on the Russian side, who they found, and then just bring back to the to police officers to be arrested. So he was involved in this wider range of direct political action, and I found him. I mean, there's no doubt that the people around him, and perhaps even him himself, were certainly ultra-nationalists. Some of them were definitely neo-Nazis. His was a bit ambiguous. And I think that's the thing to understand with Ukraine, is that it's one of the most complicated places to understand, the level of ambiguity.
It is, and it's hard to even talk about because I've been there so many times, and I do understand that, like, there is a difference between the ultra-nationalists. Not saying, oh, that's great, I love ultra-nationalism, but there is a difference between them and the actual neo-Nazis. However, often the ultra-nationalists might say, well, I don't like neo-Nazism, but I don't mind, I'll have this guy in my battalion, no problem. It's weird, it's just like this very fucking strange disconnect. It's very unfortunate, but it's Eastern Europe. I mean, what the fuck do people expect? It's very wild, very raw out there still.
It's, the far right has a big constituency. I mean, I certainly know that from being Polish. I lived in Hungary for a while, lived in Serbia for a while, spent a long time in Ukraine as well. So you can see how the political culture, and a lot of people say, well, it's not, the far right isn't something to worry about Ukraine because, the far right gets smashed at the elections. At the last Bilecki's out of parliament now because in 2019 there was a kind of a far right unity movement that kind of came together as a bloc to try and get over 5% of the vote to get into parliament, but they got like 1.5%. But I think the problem is that a lot of those policies and views have also been adopted by the mainstream, which kind of has also made them a bit more redundant. And it is as a street movement. Sometimes when you see some of these groups and how they operate, it's a terrifying number of very organised people that if there was some kind of civil disobedience in the future, what side would they be on now? I don't think you could say. So
I think as well, people kind of forget the idea that a lot of these far-right groups are fascists, so they're not going to wait to take the votes. And some of these fascists have literally whole columns of tanks. I think Azov might have 2 columns of tanks now. Now, I'm not saying that Azov is going to come out and overthrow the government, but like they could. Like, you know what I mean? They have the firepower now.
It's not healthy for a democratic society to have large groups of militias armed with extremist views. And this is one of the things that comes out, I think, later on in 1312, because I follow, Filomonov's story, and he eventually kind of falls out with the National Corps, and he falls out with Beletsky. In fact, he gets beaten up by a group of people connected to Beletsky because they fall out over. I don't know if you've come across is it Sergei Sterenko, the guy, again another right sector guy in Odessa, who's become a bit of a cause celeb for ultranationalists because he's again focusing on corruption as an activist now in Odessa, where he's from.
Yeah, he's in prison right now, isn't he?
Yeah, I think they've released him, but he's about to. So the original charge was, I think, something to do with a big protest around the president. But the big charge is that he murdered somebody because there's been 3 attempts to get on his life, and on one of those attempts, he managed to kill one of the attackers. And so his supporters see it as a politically motivated attack. Corrupt oligarchs paying people to do that, who are in league with the government. This is their view. And then, so Filomonov was turning up and organising a lot of protests around this. And I think that for some reason that upset Beletsky in that area there was somehow affected his interests. And so there was a big falling out between them. And so now, Filomonov has kind of set up this kind of, I don't know what you call it, kind of protest school, where he's teaching people how to kind of fight against kind of the police and how to fight against. It's called that and this group called Honor, which is a kind of, I don't know, kind of hooligan t-shirt graffiti firm. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but he's got this, and one of the most interesting things was I remember seeing on the news about Hong Kong back in 2019, I think it was, when they were still fighting to try to prevent this security law. And who do I see in the crowd? I see him and all his crew who have turned up there. Essentially, they said that they were tourists, but maybe they were there maybe just to help out a little bit, because they're staunch anti-communists, as you'd expect. And then what happens is that their appearance there becomes the main news item. I think it's on the main Channel 1 program in Russia, where they are then used as proof that Maidan was a CIA fermented colour revolution by fascists.
Yeah. And what actually happened was they turned up, were like, wow, these guys are pretty well organised. A load of Hong Kongers who don't even know what the fuck is going on in Ukraine went, oh cool, some guys from Ukraine came to pay their respects to us, and they went, yeah, hi, and they took some photos, and then all these fucking tankies and then Russian supporters were like, see, it's a fascist junta. It's fucking ridiculous.
So yeah, so it's quite interesting. So I've kept in contact with him because he's still doing that, and trying to forge a different path, his own kind of activist network outside of the traditional kind of far right ecosystem. Which fascinates me. It fascinates me that he does that, and it fascinates me about whether, because some of the questions I ask about is like, if you get yourself a swastika tattoo at 19, like what happens when you're 30? People change. People change their political views. I mean, I have, other people have, and that's why I think when people read 1312, it's often he's the one kind of complex, difficult to understand but fascinating people that you read about and that I met, and I keep abreast of what he's up to, and I'm sure I'll see him next time I'm in Kiev. Once, well, now I've got my second jab, I can travel a bit more, but and this is the thing is with a book like this and with the people that you meet. I met quite a few far right figures. Fabrizio Piscitelli, which is one guy I met in Italy, who's the lead the capo at Lazio, like one of the most famous figures in the world. And he ended up getting assassinated about 3 months after we spoke because he was also heavily involved in the underworld, in the drug trade, and he just got out of prison for big, after being involved in a big drug bust there. So these aren't a lot of characters who you're necessarily warm to, but they are complex and they exist out there. And I'd rather we knew that they did and why they did and what what the nuances are, rather than just say, yeah, these are just terrible people and that's it, because that's not how the world is.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting as well, I think, looking at like the organizational point of view, like you said. I think Ukraine is the most interesting because it's one where it kind of went all the way. Like the first time I heard this kind of ultras formulating kind of cells to fight the police was, like you mentioned earlier, Egypt. But as we know, they were kind of smashed and, the revolution failed badly. It went very, wrong, if you like. But with Ukraine, it's like, well, they actually managed to, fully push this through. And now there are, literally former ultra groups that are now, they have their own battalions. I'm looking at this website now, Ultras Tifo, and there are so many pictures of Ukraine soldiers and also like militia fighters holding up flags for their teams. I mean, there's like 20 plus here. Some on the Russian side as well. It seems that a lot of Russian ultras actually are fighting for the separatists as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a kind of because I suppose in a way it's all far right, but there's kind of an interesting connection as well to Belarus, because there was a big crackdown on ultras in Belarus in 2014, 2015, because a lot of guys from Belarus went over to show solidarity with Ukrainian ultras during Maidan. And, the powers that be saw that as something dangerous. They recognised that this was a powerful constituency. And what's interesting, especially in Russia, I mean, Putin, or maybe not Putin directly, but certainly, the network of people that keep him in power recognise keeping the far right and especially football firms on side is it's a very powerful. I mean, the reason why those groups, those leaders and those fighters from hooligan firms in Russia end up in Marseille in 2016 in the first place is basically on government-funded airplanes. They are given money to go there, and when it happens, I mean, Putin himself said something along the lines of like, "Well, you'd have thought with so many Englishmen there, they'd have been able to put up a fight," or something like that. Like he was smirking, like he loved it. So you can tell that the people in power, like they're addicted to football, they're addicted to the crowd. It presses all the same buttons, and I mentioned this a couple of times. I mean, I lived in Serbia, and so you can see there was a massive scandal that happened a few months ago about the leader of one of the Partizan Belgrade ultra firms was basically he was arrested suddenly, and they found videos that he'd been beheading people and been involved in all sorts of kind of the Montenegrin drug trade and all that. But they were all connected to the government. Everyone knew what they were doing, but they were essentially kept people that were useful in times of strife. So if there was a gay pride march that needed to be smashed up because these guys are religious conservatives, these are the guys that would be sent to do it. If there was, I remember in 2008 there was I think the US embassy, when Kosovo declared independence unilaterally, like the coalition of these groups ended up going and kicking the shit out of the US embassy. I think they even got in. I think one guy was killed inside the US embassy, and it's pretty hard to breach an American embassy anywhere in the world, pretty much. I mean, so it's the organisation of it, and the politicians have worked out how to utilise it, but it's in the right conditions. There's no reason why that couldn't happen again. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, man. And I do think, though, I will say, like, politics aside, obviously, disclaimer, I think anyone that listens to Popular Front knows that we fucking hate fascists. But all the politics aside, I think the idea of the football ultras is actually a really excellent concept and like a really good thing for young men and women to have a community. If you look at the Green Brigade, Celtic supporters, they've literally, helped out the club by getting rid of managers and such, and welcoming in new players. And especially as well, you mentioned St. Pauli. I've been to that stadium. They're fucking amazing things that they do there. Keeping, right? But they keep the club for the people. And now if you look at the state of Premiership football, I don't even like football because I can't be bothered with it. It's like, it just seems like another commercial thing to me now. But I think the ultras really keep the kind of spirit of football alive,
Well, look, it's messy, right? And the way I've always looked at it is that ultra groups reflect their constituency, right? So, like football stadiums reflect because they're in the community. So the curve, right, the place where the ultras stand, reflects pretty much the community they're from, and that's usually a kind of working class and it's a young person's game, usually a working class male kind of constituency. And so one of the examples I use is in Italy in the 1970s, you had this almost a civil war going on. The years of lead, where you had far left and far right activists kind of bombing each other, murdering each other, kidnapping former prime ministers and killing them. Like bombings going on. Like I think the Bologna train bombing and almost 100 people were killed. It was extremist. And so in the centre of Rome, where it was kind of the heart of the support for the Communist Party in the city, that's where the supporters from Roma came from. So their ultra groups were all left wing. They have got names like the Fedayeen, for instance, which came from the political guerrilla from the Palestinian guerrilla movement. So what happens is Italy changes. So over time, Italy becomes much more right wing. The inner cities of Rome become much more right wing, and then essentially the Roma ultras become far right. Like Lazio ultras had always been far right, but Rome changed, and all the other curves around Italy, they changed in the same way. But if you look at Germany, you touched on Hamburg there and St. Pauli, but again, it reflects their society. So you see so much left-wing activism, especially in more Western and in the big cities. You've got ultras at Bayern Munich campaigning against Qatar sponsoring their club and against the World Cup and against slavery, what they say slavery in Qatar. There, you've got. When I last went to the Milan tour to watch St. Pauli play, they were playing like it was the kind of refugee crisis in full swing. And I think it was just before, or I think it might be just after Merkel allowed, I think, 1 million people to cross over the border. And especially in Eastern Germany, where it's much more right wing, ultra groups. They're singing about Merkel weg, Merkel must go, Merkel must go. Whereas there, they were inviting, like the Ultra St. Pauli were inviting Syrian refugees from the camps, going and picking them up and bringing them to the stadium so they had a day out and watched the football with them.
That's beautiful.
And they had a couple of Syrians who ended up joining them, becoming Ultras with them. I was there, I spoke to one of these guys.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's what football should be about.
Exactly, and it was, so you see that, and even when you have left wing and right wing, there's certain issues that they can agree on, like against the commercialization of football, high ticket prices. It's like having televised games on a Monday night, because if you're a working person, you can't travel from one end of Germany to the next. You've got to take a day off and you can't afford it. So, they campaigned against that and they were successful. They changed, the FA had to back down, the league had to back down time and time and time again. So, yeah, there is a lot of stories of the right and the far right and ultra movements, but it is it's a fascinating and diverse movement. Like you said, Green Brigade, pro-Palestinian, definitely say on the left wing, and you have groups. Atalanta in Bergamo, who I'd say probably more apolitical, but certainly again, when I met the leader there, Il Boccia, who's a guy who's been banned from the stadiums pretty much for 25 years. But this is a guy who says, we go out and we organise things for recovering drug addicts and raise money for them, help them get jobs. And this is a guy who's absolutely saw that ultra groups help the community first and foremost, and said he didn't, because a lot of the far right ultra groups end up kind of being co-opted by the mafia in many respects as a way to kind of extort money out of the club. But this guy was like, we're not going to take a penny out of the club. We don't take a penny out of the club. Everything we put into our materials to make a banner or to help people in our city. And they organise pretty much the biggest festival in Bergamo, which they, thousands of people turn up to, and it's like a massive thing. Bergamo is quite a posh place now, and so yeah, you've got this. It's not what people think it is. I know we've just spent most of the past hour talking about the far right and neo-Nazis and all the rest and everyone in between in Ukraine, but there's a wide story of activism and civil disobedience that finds its roots on football terraces, and to be honest, I'm amazed no one had written a book about it before, pretty much.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way for like a kind of grassroots community to introduce a kind of, autonomous direct democracy into something they believe in, without it having to be, hashtag ACAB, hashtag I'm a part of this group, hashtag. It's more real, it's more grassroots, I think, when it comes from the football ultras, rather than like, what I consider kind of bandwagoning, trendy politics right now. It's been around for ages as well, right?
Yeah, so like its roots are in again the years of lead in the late '60s. The first group comes out of Milan, and again the years of lead shaped the ultra movement, and it's essentially the kind of all the paraphernalia that you see, the banners, climactic displays that you see at political protests end up on the terraces, and that sets the kind of aesthetic for ultras all around the world. So wherever you went, if you go to like. Probably there's quite a few scary moments in the book. I mean, there was one I don't know if you probably have a story about the moment that you thought you were going to die, which is probably much scarier than mine. But there was a moment where I was chased down the side of an Indonesian highway by a bunch of Persib Bandung ultras with machetes, and it was absolutely one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I managed to escape by the skin of our teeth.
Fucking machetes.
Machetes. There were two groups of machetes, because that's probably the most violent ultra scene in the world right now is Indonesia. And when you go, the names of the groups are like a Brigata Curva Sud. It's Italian. They call the top guy the capo.
So they're taking on the old kind of culture.
They've taken the kind of Italian vibe and aesthetic, but the fashion is like definitely like football casual, like 90s English football casual, right? So you go outside and you'll see like Millwall tops, you'd see like badges with West Ham hammers. You see the old British Rail symbol.
Oh, that's cool.
Because the intercity firm used to use that, because that's how they would travel between cities to fight. And this wasn't even Jakarta. This was in where was it? It was like in the far southeast of Java. And so it tells you first of all, how attractive that is to young people. And I think you hit that on the head there, that this isn't hashtag activism, and they go against that. What in real life where do young people get together in big numbers in a cultural way like that? Like, you've got online gaming, of course, is completely separate, but like as a community, that is, once you have that together, it's a very, very strong bond that you make with people. And that's one of the things that is clear that when you meet ultra groups. And one guy I met from an ultra group from Werder Bremen, again another left-wing group, told me that this is why it should be for young people, because you're testing the barriers of what you can and can't get away with. You're testing yourself, you're testing society. And I thought that was a brilliant way to put it. I mean, of course, some people stay in it too long, but usually when you're in your 30s, you're too old for it. I don't think I could have written this book in 5 years' time. I think I would have, I think probably would have been too old and would have stuck out too much. But that was a great way to see it. I think that this is a youth culture that teaches people how far they can push it, and I don't think that's an unhealthy thing.
No, I don't either, not at all. And also, you see these clubs. I've seen people online, season ticket holders for, I don't know, fucking Man U or whatever, moaning about ultra groups interfering with the clubs, and I just think, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's what they're meant to do. Like, these people are shafting you, like, one of the best situations I've ever been in, I went to watch Wigan away. Like, my best friend is from Wigan, and a friend of ours, she was over from Australia, so we were like, fuck it, let's take her to a football match. And we went to Wigan away in like South London, and the Wigan fans, we stood in the stands, and the Wigan fans started chanting, "We're shit and we know we are." And I just thought, like, that is absolutely brilliant. That to me was like the essence of proper football.
How many of them were there? Because there are not many Wigan fans that turn up for home games.
Yeah, there was about 10 of them maybe, but it was quite impressive.
Because what's interesting is that, like, there's not a chapter in the book about England, because we didn't really have an ultras movement, because our indigenous movement, like in Brazil, they have the Torcida Organizadas, which again, a lot of them have been co-opted by organised crime. The Barras Bravas in Argentina and in Colombia and the rest of South America. But in Argentina, that's quite a frightening scene as well. And a lot of these have been, cartels are kind of involved in a lot of them as well. But our indigenous kind of fang thing was, the casual movement, the hooligan movement. And in the 80s, that almost destroys football. And then you have, which by the way has nothing to do with hooliganism, it was down to the police is Hillsborough. But what that eventually leads to is a type of reform in English football that changes the stadiums, changes the type of person that goes to football, and essentially ends the way that English football fans are policed is disgusting. It's like I remember going to a West Ham Leicester away, and the coach stops about 20 miles outside of Leicester. You're taken off, you're searched. You can't buy any booze at the petrol station. You get taken back. You're told you're not allowed to get off the coach. You've got to go straight into the stadium. Like, you're told you can't go into Leicester. Like, you're prevented from, like, you're travelling, right? And if you cause an offence, they deem an offence. Whilst the football fan, then you are treated more harshly for it, and you can be have your passport taken. You can be restricted from your movements, travelling abroad. And this all comes out of the reforms from the 1990s, which turns the Premier League into this very middle class, very kind of wealthy game. But what it means is there's no space within like top level football clubs really for that type of ultra organising. You can't, like, if you turned up with a flare in an English Premier League game, like I reckon you might get beaten to death by the police. Like, they wouldn't know what to do. What the fucking turn up with a flare? Like, it's just so anathema to have that kind of, or even like political banners, messages on everything's got to be pre-approved. So the control within English football stadiums is such that it's impossible for a kind of grassroots political culture to set. I mean, Scotland is slightly different, and the Green Brigade is slightly different. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, one of my favourite chapters in the book, and this is on the exact opposite end of the scale to the kind of far right in Eastern Europe, was I went to LAFC, which is like a brand new football club in MLS in LA. And they had a group. I mean, it's very Latino character. They had female capos, which is the first time I've ever seen women in the cages leading the songs. They had, the day I was there, it was an LGBT day, and they had like their tifo, their big choreography was a massive Freddie Mercury being winched up whilst they sang "We Will Rock You." Right?
I like that.
They had one ultra group, which was a pro weed ultra group. What do they call it? Is it the 40? What's that number? That's the weed number. 40.
420.
420. So it's the 420, right? And they were just stoned.
We can't let Americans have everything, though, because they do stuff like this.
They do stuff like that, but it is, and you went there, and I just thought, like a lot of people would say that's very plastic, but a lot of people would say that about German football as well. It's a bit plastic, but it just shows you that, and they called themselves ultras. They had again. There was league approved pyro, which I found was the most, like, they weren't allowed to bring their own smoke, but there was a smoke machine that the league approved that was turned on, but not too much. I think it was only allowed on for 3 goals. That's it. After that, they weren't allowed to have anything. So it was completely controlled. But I tell you what, compared to an experience in an English football stadium, it was you could drink in it for one, so it was a much better experience. But I guess what I wanted to finish on was the idea that in England, where you find ultra culture now, other than in Scotland, is at grassroots clubs. So there's like Clapton, for instance, in London.
Clapton, yeah.
Again, like you have ultra groups where they're allowed to have some freedom to exist and build an identity and a network for themselves, which then connects to other like-minded groups all across Europe and around the world. That's where it is. So it's not in the Premier League. It's in the 5th, 6th, 7th division that you'll find it. And so, a lot of people are finding much more freedom. And even though the football isn't as good, when's it always been about football? It's about tribalism, and it's about. I mean, I don't support West Ham because they're the best team in the country. It's because my dad supported West Ham, and because my mates supported West Ham, and it's about being part of a club and a tribe, and that's what people are discovering, that you can find that in England, but just a bit further down the pyramid. I mean, this is a long way from conflict journalism, but
Well, there's I think the sort of young men that end up fighting each other in woods in Eastern Europe to feel something, I guess, are often, but they, whether they realise it or not, are the same kind of lads in the Middle East that end up having to fight because there's a war has come to their doorstep, or ex-Western country has dropped a bomb on their roof or whatever. It's young men need something. I'm not saying they need war, but I mean, like, I think the kind of ultra scene. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad politics or whatever in it, but I do think the ultra scene is quite a healthy place for young men to kind of get that out,
It's a brotherhood, and people find that in lots of other places, that connection with other humans, which in the atomized world that we live in is becoming rarer and rarer, and that they can still have that. And I think you're right. It's the same part of the brain that makes you a biker, or it makes you want to be like really into death metal. It's something. It's and this is a very physical world where you're touching people, you're in touch with people, and that's really rare.
Yeah, man, definitely. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap this up?
Please buy my book, 1312 Among the Ultras. I don't know, is that a bit? That's
no, totally promote it, man. It's a great book. Promote it 100%.
So yeah, 1312 is the paperback version is out now with Penguin, and I think you can get it in the US as well. Yeah, it was out in June, so you can get it in the US as well. And there's a German version as well, and a Polish version, a Japanese version coming out. So I don't know if any of your listeners are in Japan, but there's one coming out this month.
We've got a few actually. Yeah. What's your Twitter and all that, mate? Where can people get hold of you if they want to ask any more questions about all this?
Yeah, Twitter is at James Piotr, so JamesPiotr, and that's where you can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, mate.
Cheers.
That was journalist James Montague speaking about the various ways in which football ultras have helped and aided uprisings and wars across the world, all the way from Ukraine to Egypt and more. If you like what we're doing, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/Popular Front. Remember, we do not accept money from large-scale corporate investment or anything like that. Everything we do here is grassroots. If you want to support us, you get bonus content. Subscribe at patreon.com/Popular Front. Or if you want, you can donate to us or talk about maybe some kind of deal. I don't know. Go to www.popularfront.co/support or buy our merchandise. The website is popularfront.shop. Now, let's talk about merchandise for a minute. So if you're on our social medias and whatever, you will have seen that we did a Free Britney t-shirt. Now you might be thinking, why the fuck would a media collective platform about war and conflict give a shit about this Britney Spears thing? Well, if there's anything we definitely hate at Popular Front, it is authoritarianism of any stripe. We hate it. We don't like it. Fuck it. It's horrible. It's the worst thing. So when I was reading about this Britney Spears thing, I was like, this is fucking awful and very bad. But luckily, she can kind of, afford to live, can afford to fight the case still. But there are a lot of women that are in, situations where there's perhaps an authoritarian boot over their head and they can't get out of it. So we said, you know what? Let's make this Free Britney Spears t-shirt, and we will donate 100% of the profits to the National Women's Law Center. They're a charity that basically helps women in underprivileged situations with various different legal situations, helping them get out of bad situations. If you don't think that's a good cause, fuck you, basically. We think it's a good cause. So yeah, NWLC, we raised about $10,000. And then the company we used to print these t-shirts, it was a really cool t-shirt, Britney Spears in a balaclava. It says, authoritarianism is toxic, Free Britney, Popular Front. The print company said, nah, that's a screenshot from a video of Britney Spears. We're not going to print it now, despite the fact we just raised all of this money for charity. So I said, all right, fuck it. So we raised the money. We donated the money anyway. But basically that left me with, obviously I have to pay 100% of the profits went towards it, but I still have to pay for the shirts. So that was about £9,000 or something like that this company owed me, this print shop, which was a fucking nightmare. Eventually we got it back, severed ties with them. The company's Printful, I don't know, Printful, fuck you. You're an absolute piece of shit company. Fuck you from Popular Front. You literally tried to derail a fucking charity drive to help women in need because of some stupid fucking copyright issue. And when I spoke to a lawyer, they said it is free use by an absolute fucking mile and would get laughed out of court. Basically, you're just too scared. You fucking covered your own asses and tried to derail our charity drive. But it's not been derailed because we've spoken to another print shop, a few different print companies in the US. The Free Britney t-shirt is going to be printed within the next few weeks, and it will be delivered all over the US. Don't worry, it's coming. I haven't found a good European print shop that will print them and deliver them for us, because, you know, we sold like a load of them. I can't fucking just, you know, hand deliver them all. It's a fucking nightmare. It's a madness. So not found the European side of it yet, but the US one, where the majority of the orders came from, the t-shirt is coming. Give it a few weeks, maybe months. I'm sorry, but, you know, it was a charity thing. All of the money has been already donated to charity. We put that on the Instagram, on the internet. That's all there to see. Got the emails from the NWLC. You know, we've donated the money, every single penny. We've been completely transparent about that, as we always are. We've done plenty of things to donate to charity. So yeah, the money to the charity, it's already, you know, it's already been donated. But the shirts are just taking a little bit longer because, like I said, the scumbags at Printful tried to fuck up our shit and wouldn't print them. Anyway, that's just the update on the Free Britney shirts. This episode, thank you to our sponsors. The episode is sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue, 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. You might get a discount. I don't know. The episode is also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. We are doing a Popular Front collaboration with them soon, I absolutely promise. Those guys are very busy, I'm very busy, but I've tried it, sampled the coffee, blah blah, the coffee that they're going to be selling, all free trades, fair trade I should say. Tastes good, it will blow your fucking head off. It's good coffee, good and strong. You know, if you're waiting and you're wondering, just talk to them on social media at Grindcore House. Ask them, hey, when's the Popular Front collaboration coming out? I'm sure they'll love you and me for that. Yeah. The episode is also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. Buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use promo code PopularFront10 for 10% off. If you want to follow us on social media, the Insta is at popular.front. Follow the backup as well, because we're probably going to get zooked soon, because the people that work at Facebook or on Instagram don't realize that reporting on violent extremism and wars is not the same as causing violent extremism and wars. Somehow doesn't compute. So we're probably going to get taken down soon. We're constantly getting flagged, but yeah, whatever, fuck it. The backup is at popularfront_. Twitter is at popularfrontco. What else? Fuck knows. Yeah, website popularfront.shop for merchandise, popularfront.co for everything else. If you want to follow me on anything, it's at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. If you've messaged me and I haven't replied, it's either like too busy or I just haven't checked it. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, please do support us on Patreon. Thank you very much to... Oh yeah, wait, hang on. Sorry, fucking hell. Intro music was by Home and the outro music was by Sam Black. Listen to his music at samblackpf.com. Now, thank you very much to the high tier Patreons. They are Kate, Ellen, Dan Ross, Thumper, Lisa Milgram, Lupita Valens, Bradley Davies, Peter Hesher, RX, A. Nicole, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, MJ, Meredith Waters, Adam H, Larson 8669, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Jacob, Michael O'Connor, Zach Packard, Todd Cravens, Alexander, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Trinan Daly, Tynan Tainan Daily, apologies if I've said that wrong, let me know. Michael Akakan, Ethan, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Johnny LaFleur, Clayton Taylor, Mike Barone, Ben, Liam Williams, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Ali Hunter, Moody Al Rashid, Bill Wilson, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Stephen Davila, Anthony Kabarak, Dan Dunham, Fletcher Tate, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Maurice Zumbul. Thank you all so much, top tier patrons, much appreciated. Cheers.